In this week's lecture, we're going to talk about expanding circles. Expanding circles. You all saw this, but okay, so last time we were talking about English as a lingua franca and whether you thought it was fair or not that English is a lingua franca and whether English as a lingua franca makes any sense at all. You know, all these myths and all these arguments that English is more beautiful or somehow more logical or somehow more simple to acquire. But is it really? And I think that's where we last left off before this whole pandemic situation. We were questioning English's role or whether, you know, it was truthful or whether it was the best idea to have English as a lingua franca. And then we also discussed the reasons why it was probably a lingua franca already, you know, and why it's being adopted everywhere. And we spoke about its role, you know, in our global world, in science, business, medicine, in government, in emergency situations, in the cloud technology. We spoke about it in every domain that we can think of. So moving on. We also discussed the difference between what it means to talk about English as a lingua franca and English as a foreign language. So English as a foreign language is when we talk about people who are non-native speakers of English, usually in countries that have nothing to do with English-speaking countries, like Asian countries or European countries that have no direct ties or history with English-speaking populations. And they choose to acquire English as a foreign language, right? Because in their context, English is not institutionalized. It's not in the language policy of education. So they have the option to acquire English as a foreign language. So non-native speakers acquire English as a foreign language with the intention to talk to native speakers of English. So with the intention of moving to an English-speaking place or for it to facilitate conversation with people who speak English, okay? So that's what English as a foreign language is. But when we talk about English as a lingua franca, we're talking about communities of non-native English speakers that maybe they don't share the same language, okay? So maybe they speak different languages and they use English as a bridge language to communicate with each other through intercultural communication. That's the act that they're engaging in. So that was kind of where we left off last time. And today we're going to talk about the role of English in these situations of English as a lingua franca, okay, and English as a foreign language. So we can talk about two large non-inner circle English populations, okay? So obviously English is a global language. It's been adopted by people all over the world, in different countries all over the world, and different continents, etc. So two of the biggest non-native speaker populations are in Europe and Asia. Okay, they're one of the biggest and powerful list, whatever. So in one hand, you have expanding circle Europe. So when we talk about expanding circle Europe, we're referring to, if you remember the Kashrut circle, maybe I can like draw a little diagram. So this feels weird. I feel like a blogger. This is the weirdest sentiment. I actually didn't want to feel like a blogger. I wanted to feel like a professor. That's why I wanted to do lives, but oh well. So in our concentric circle, ay Dios mío. we have something like this. It looks like an upside down snowman, or maybe I have it all wrong. So inner circle, outer circle, expanding circle. Okay? So expanding circle is outside. It has people that are maybe already bilingual, or people who are acquiring English as a foreign language. Outer circle, right outside of inner circle, is people that are learning English as a second language through institutional means. So we're in the expanding circle right now. We're in the one that goes after the outside. So in the expanding circle Europe, there's an increasing number of speakers learning English for professional and academic purposes. So there's people that, you know, they acquire English for their everyday business profession. So maybe your business is in technology. So European technology, the tech hub, IT, is largely dominated by English speakers, by an English-speaking population. So they host conferences and events like the Web Summit in Lisbon, which is held, I think, annually, I'm not sure, but it's held in the English language. And we also have European Union meetings when we have countries from different parts of Europe, and they come together and they interact and they speak, they engage in different languages. And one of those languages that European Union people engage in is English. So English plays a role in the government in Europe, in businesses, and also in academia, which is our last picture below. So in the realm of education, there are a lot of academic institutions around Europe that have English programs, even if they're not in an English-speaking country. Okay, so this actually expands the opportunities and the possibilities of English speakers to partake in foreign exchange programs, or Erasmus is what they call it. So Erasmus is ERASMUS. That's the name for their exchange program in Europe, you know, within the EU, within the European Union. I kind of like this background more than the Harry Potter one. I feel like it gives me more of an English professor vibe. I think I'm going to stick to it. Okay, so because of its spread and frequent usage, initially some linguists hypothesized that expanding circle European English would develop in a similar way as varieties of outer circle Englishes, like Indian English. What does this mean? It means that because of English's global currency and how increasingly people from all over the world are acquiring and learning English, especially people within the European Union for the purposes that I mentioned before, because it's so widespread in Europe, some people were inclined to, at the beginning, come up with models and theories as to a sort of collective European English. So like a dialect or a variety of English spoken in Europe alone, Euro-English. So the idea of Euro-English sounds appealing, but but it's not necessarily practical, and it's not necessarily truthful, in that within the EU, if you really think about it, there's so many different countries and multicultural groups and different language communities. We have Spain, we have France, we have Italy, we have from all over the place. So it's a really linguistically diverse region. Okay, so because it's so linguistically diverse, we have people from different linguistic backgrounds acquiring English. So that means that it's people who have in their minds, they have housed different language bases or different linguistic foundations. So I, for instance, let's say I'm from Spain. In my brain, I have Spanish, and then I'm acquiring English, and my English is being influenced by my Spanish, and my Spanish by my English, etc. So what that looks like in my brain is not necessarily the same as what that looks like for a French speaker, for a Dutch speaker, for a German speaker, okay? Because first of all, Spanish is a Romance language. So it has a lot of structural differences to English, whereas English is a little bit similar to Dutch. So English shares a lot similar structural similarities to Dutch and Swedish and etc. Versus like Spanish, but okay. So taking this into consideration and how this could potentially influence language production, is it really feasible to even talk about a collective Euro-English, uniting all of the different 23 or 24 official languages of Europe and saying that they all speak the same dialect of English? Sounds a little bit like a dream. So indeed, there is no consistent way in which English is being acquired or used by these speakers, and it lacks the uniformity and stability to describe a European variety. So what does that mean? That means that, okay, yeah, they're all from different linguistic backgrounds, right? But also, let's see. Also, there's probably a lot of different levels of bilingualism. Maybe some people are more dominant than others. You have a lot of individual differences, and also to add on top of that, dialect differences, and also to add on top of that, educational, class, gender differences. So there's so many different potential variations, but probably the biggest one is the linguistic multilingual one. So it's too inconsistent to even begin talking about a collective European English dialect. So some people have suggested that, okay, maybe we can't talk about a dialect called Euro-English, but maybe we can talk about it, or maybe conceive of European English under the Similex paradigm. So if you remember from like our other weeks, we said that Similex are, you know, situations where a language evolves in a parallel way, even though it's evolving in different speakers or different speech communities, it's evolving in similar ways. So we do have to go through different language acquisition stages or different language learning stages. So maybe there's enough parallels or similarities between language learners to conceive of a similect. Maybe not a dialect, but maybe a European similect. Sounds like a plausible idea. I feel like I would have to read more into that to see the logistics behind it, but it sounds a little bit better. So what about expanding circle Asia and their Englishes? Are they any easier to decipher than European Englishes? So now we're in Asia. So English spoken in Asian countries is also quite diverse and could be difficult to describe as a variety. What does this mean? Nevertheless, attempts have been made to label commonalities in Asian Englishes. So the same way that European English is a little bit of a fuzzy idea, it's also a fuzzy, problematic idea in Asian contexts. But apparently, there have been attempts to describing the English spoken in Asia as a type of learner variety. So there have been attempts to talk about the commonalities that unite Asian learners of English. So one of the examples that is cited by Jenkins is Wang, 2013, and her idea of Chinese English lingua franca. Okay? So she defines Chinese as in English lingua franca, Chinese ELF, Chinese English lingua franca, as an ELF with Chinese characteristics. So again, ELF meaning that it emerges to talk to other people from other communities, other cultures, other linguistic backgrounds that don't share the same language. So they pick up on English sort of as a bridge language between different Asian languages. Okay, so they use English, and maybe they do so in a consistent way, or in a way that we can talk about similarities with Chinese influence. So that's an interesting idea. I wonder whether that would hold, for instance, with all Latino populations. So people from different dialects of Spanish in South America, and whether we could talk about not necessarily an ELF, but a Spanish EFL. So an English, a Spanish EFL. So Spanish English as a foreign language, because in Latin America, they acquire it as a foreign language. So maybe there are enough characteristics that unite speakers from different dialects of Spanish to talk about that. I have a grandfather clock, so we'll wait for that to finish. I cannot control my clock, but I feel like it gives my videos an atmospheric feel. Okay, so outer circle Englishes. So outer circle Asian varieties have been identified, described, and some codified. So we saw an example previously with the Chinese ELF. So in that example that you should note, Chinese ELF, lingua franca. Cuando estamos hablando de lingua franca, when we talk about lingua franca, what population of English speakers are we talking about? Expanding circle Asia. So expanding circle, our third circle, ¿verdad? So it's ELF because it's our third circle. In this example, we're talking about Asian Englishes, but not in the expanding circle, Asian Englishes in the outer circle. So the outer circle is our second circle. Okay, so outer circle Asian varieties have been identified, described, and some codified. So unlike our expanding circle Englishes, which can be a little bit more problematic and hard to describe and define, our outer circle Englishes are consistent enough for people to document similarities in them, as you know, and conceive of them as a variety. So Europe and Asian Englishes, similarities. English users in and of these places do not necessarily differ from the norms of British and American Englishes. So I think that's an important point, because a lot of times if we give something a name, like Hispanic Latino English, or African American English, or Asian English, European Englishes, whatever, then we say, it has a different name, so it must be different grammatically a lot, maybe drastically enough from British and American, but it's not necessarily the case. So Englishes in these regions are evolving, albeit differently, in context of bi and multilingualism. So although they're not too different from British and American Englishes, at the end of the day, they probably have more consistency in syntax, right? In structure and in vocabulary. And at the end of the day, probably their main difference is in the accent, okay, in pronunciation. And one of the aspects or factors that can influence phonology a lot, as well as other linguistic fields, is the fact of, are we talking about a monolingual speaker, or are we talking about a bilingual and multilingual speaker? Because someone who's monolingual only has one language housed in their minds, but someone who's bilingual or multilingual has multiple linguistic systems, and they're all influencing each other, okay? Not necessarily always will they influence each other, but they could potentially, okay? So two different linguistic minds, two different language minds. So while we can say that outer circle Englishes can be codified, documented, they are evolving Englishes. They are sort of similar. They do take from British and American English, but they're different in that they reflect language contact in their makeup. So they reflect bilingualism in their DNA, some bilingual traces, maybe some indigenous words or indigenous structure, sentence structures. So they, alongside other non-inner circle English, may not have English in institutions or be institutionalized. So that's kind of like, again, going back to the idea that the outer circle and expanding circle Englishes don't necessarily have schools backing them up, but it's especially the case for expanding circle. So expanding circles do definitely not necessarily have institutions to, you know, back them up or promote a standard variety. Okay, so you can bet that because they don't necessarily have an institution, they develop in wild ways, in various ways. Although, you know, there's still some consistencies. So, Kashru, who's the guy who came up with the concentric circle model, says that Englishes in Asia and Europe could be seen as linguistic orphans in search of their parents, which sounds like a bit of a dramatic statement in linguistics, but meaning that, you know, maybe their parents would be enforced through institutions, right? Or through policy. But because the policy is not there, or the standardization effort is not as prevalent, it's not as mandatory, they could be seen as orphans going wild and free. So Kashru has a negative, displays a negative linguistic ideology, or maybe actually he doesn't display it because he's a linguist. But in this case, Kashru, this quote of the Kashru, actually, let me clarify. This Kashru quote is talking about how English could be seen by others, how these Englishes of Europe and Asia could be seen by others as linguistic orphans going wild. So they're so crazy, they have nothing to do with the original English. Okay, so in that quote, Kashru is citing an ideology against expanding and outer circle Englishes as like random and not systematic. So a negative linguistic ideology attached to the nativized Englishes of these regions is that they have no tie or little tie, and they're crazy and they're not legitimate and they're mistakes. So categorization of Englishes in Asia. So Asian Englishes can be characterized in terms of region and in terms of function. Okay, so if we talk about region, we can talk about 3 distinct groups that have been identified by linguists. And although some linguists only make the distinction between 2, South Asian varieties, Southeast Asian and Pacific varieties, right? But in our table, A7.1, we have South Asian varieties. So that counts as Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. We have Southeast Asian and Pacific varieties. These are Brunei, Cambodia, Fiji, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam. East Asian varieties, China, oh my God, China, Hong Kong, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. Something just really scary happened as I was reading this aloud, the word Asian or some word. My Amazon speaker detected my voice and asked me a question, and suddenly I felt like there was somebody here, an intruder. Sorry. Shut up, Alexa. She's paying attention now. Okay. So, no longer. Okay, so these are the three regions that some people make a distinction. That's also a cool, probably a quiz question. Which regions do people make a distinction when they talk about English in Asia? So functionally, when we talk about the functions of English in Asia, we can divide it into two functions. So the two main functions is that we can talk about institutionalized Englishes, that means English in schools, or we can talk about non-institutionalized English, which means English not in school. So it has the function as school, specifically for outer circle Asia, definitely tied to school. Non-institutionalized happens in the expanding circle because the government isn't obliged to speak it. Schools aren't made to teach it or learn it. So we can talk about institution and non-institution in terms of functions. So countries that have English speakers with reasonable competence. So yes, there's a lot of English speakers in the world, but here we are talking about Asian Englishes, specifically Asian English communities with relatively good speakers of English. So let's see who are cited. So we have India with leading the way with over 200 million speakers of English. Then we have Philippines with 40 million, Pakistan 17 million, Hong Kong 2 million, Sri Lanka 2 million, Brunei 134,000, Bhutan 75,000. Okay. But one of the things that you should probably consider, and we will talk about, is how, these numbers look quite big, but you need to contextualize these numbers, okay? Specifically, you need to think about ratios. So, okay, 200 million looks like a lot, but how many people are there in India? Yeah? And how is this number distributed across India? So that is kind of like, they look appealing, these numbers, but what are the stats? If we were to consider the numbers presented in the previous slide in terms of ratio, almost half of Singaporeans speak English as a second language. So 2 million out of 4.3 million. In Hong Kong, we would say that 2 million, but it constitutes a third of the total Hong Kong population, un tercio. It's not even half. And India, which was leading the way in numbers, if we contextualize it, they have less than a fifth of Indians speak English as a second language. And the total population of India is 1 billion, which is insane. super insane. So, South Asian Englishes. So, South Asian Englishes, when we talk about South Asia, we're talking about a specific region. So, what counts as part of South Asia? Well, we have it down here. India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, and Maldives. That's South Asia, okay? So when we talk about South Asian countries, which are also pictured in the image above, so we have them all here. They're kind of like grouped around India, if you see. They're like south of China, and also between Iran and China. So they're outer circle. That means that they're the second circle of our concentric circle model, which means that they probably have English institutionalized in schools or at the government level. So as part of the outer circle, out of these South Asian countries that we spoke, outer circle English out of these would be Indian, Sri Lankan, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi. But notice how in this list of outer circle Englishes, we don't necessarily have Nepal, we don't have Bhutan, and we don't have Maldives. And there's a reason for this, and we'll discuss that very, very soon. So when we talk about South Asian Englishes, yes, there are several South Asian countries, but not all of them have adopted English equally, okay? So especially if we were to talk about the most documented or most linguistically developed English community, we could refer to Indian English. Indian English is highly documented by linguists and books. Sri Lankan English is also developed and documented, but more undocumented, least developed, and more fuzzy is to talk about the existence of an English in Bhutan, or an English in Nepal, or an English in Maldives. That's why I've refrained from putting the word English next to these countries versus Indian English and Sri Lankan English, which have been documented by linguists. So, for instance, let's talk about our Nepal, which is a South Asian country, Nepal. So not that much is known about English in Nepal. From 2005 to 2007, an action plan in primary education involved teaching of 3 languages: Nepali, a local language, and English. Okay, so not much is known other than the fact that in those years, 2005, 2007, they made a rule for school to teach those 3 languages, que era el de Nepal, el uno local, a local one, and English. So let's dive into the outer circle South Asian Englishes. So let's dive into those that are documented linguistically, and those that are less problematic than talking about the existence of an English in Nepal. So we have Indian English in first position, Lankan English, Pakistani English, and Bangladeshi English. So we can talk about Englishes in these separate communities. So English in Bangladesh, for instance, particularly post-colonial Bangladesh. Post-colonial means after the period of colonialism, which is the times that we live in now for most of the world. So there's little interest in Bangladesh in learning and speaking English right now, beyond utilitarian purposes. What does utilitarian mean? Well, utilitarian refers to uso, use. So like instrumentality, practicality. So utilitarian means that widening the axis and preparing oneself to engage in the activities of global times. So extremely practical purposes I learn English because I want to get into the realm of business or into IT, or I learn English because I want to travel. So all of these purposes are down to and motivated by use. Okay? So, or a specific use, and that specific use has its own specific function, its own function. They don't want to learn English because of the, you know, it appears anyway for the cognitive benefits of multilingualism. They don't want to necessarily acquire it to talk in every day to their peers or whatever. Mainly just usage based. Okay, so that's Bangladesh. Pakistani English. So back then, they were not so invested in English until recently. Okay, so right now, they are interested in developing their own variety of English. So maybe back then, like Bangladesh, they were like, English, okay, it's useful. But now it seems to have a more present role in their country, and more people are speaking it, and maybe even with each other. So maybe we can talk about the development of a variety here, you know, when people are using it in their daily lives on a regular basis. So Pakistani English, still under development. British English is being used as a reference point. So yes, it's developing apart from standard English. You know, it's in a different context. People speak another language, but they're still modeling their grammar based on the standard, the emblem of the most prestigious English. Something you should know is that currently in Pakistan, there are actually there are two official languages. One of the languages is Urdu as an official language, but they also have English. Okay, so English is an official language in Pakistan today, but they also speak other languages like Punjabi, Pashto, Sindhi, and Balochi. I don't know how to say that one. So English is an official language, has an official status right now in Pakistan. So we can talk about it as a type of English or a variety of English, because it seems like there's some institutionalized efforts taking place.